Hello, and welcome to our Civic Engagement Lunch Talk. I'm Norma Ramos. I'm the Associate Director here at the Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement, and I'd like to welcome you to our talk on inclusive open government data for environmental justice, enhancing community stakeholders' voices. Today's presentation is presented by our guest speaker and awardee, Assistant Professor Fusi from the Department of Public Policy, Management, and Analytics at UIC. Along with collaborators, Assistant Professor Zhang from Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, and Assistant Professor Liang from Department of Public Policy, Management, and Analytics at UIC. They will share how the project calls attention to the implementation of open government data as a critical tool for environmental justice policymaking. Using website data and data from a national survey of public managers working in the US state environmental agencies, they will discuss the following questions. To what extent do government agencies adopt open and inclusive data practices? When and to what extent are vulnerable communities actively involved in data governance? Their results will provide insights to strengthen the civic engagement of environmental justice, community stakeholders, and increase government responsiveness to the data divide. We would like to welcome Professor Fusi, Professor Zhang, and Professor Liang today. So thank you, and I'm going to pass over the mic.
Thank you, Norma, for the introduction. It was actually great. I think you need to allow me to share.
I may just stop sharing.
Perfect, thank you. Okay. And I think you should see my slides now. Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I'm very happy to share some preliminary findings, I would say, from this project. We just starting to analyze the data, so any feedback, questions, or comments that you might have will actually actively help us to move this project forward. And Norma did a great job in introducing what were the main research goals that we had when we started the project, I think now back in late 2019. So our interests were really to try to understand to what extent government agencies are implementing inclusive data practice, and when and to what extent are vulnerable communities involved in civic engagement activities. And our focus is specifically on the context of environmental justice. And let me start by giving you a little bit of background on the way that we thought about approaching these issues of civic engagement, open data within the environmental justice context. So when we think about environmental justice, we generally refer to this policy principle that no group of people should bear a disproportionate share of adverse environmental consequences that might stem from past government policies, but also commercial and industrial decisions. The concept became popular in the late 80s when Charles developed these reports showing that toxic waste sites were much more likely to be located in communities that were predominantly made by minority groups or low-income groups. The concept is widely diffused in policy now. Think that by 2009-13, at least 35 states had at least incorporated environmental justice into their policy agenda to some extent. And it went even more at the center of policy discussion in the past couple of years, because environmental justice is one of the top priorities of President Biden's agenda, who really focus on addressing some of these fairness issues into environmental pollution distribution. But what's key to understand about environmental justice policymaking is the role that data plays. In order for us to actually be able to define any areas of being of environmental justice concern, we actually need to integrate geographically located data on social vulnerability. So we need to understand where groups that are traditionally more likely to be harmed by government policies, but also less able to answer and respond and react to those policies, are geographically located, which means understanding where, like, Those groups are generally characterized by minority status, Hispanic ethnicity, lower income, higher older age, lower level of educations, and so on. And we need to understand where those groups are located in response to environmental vulnerability. So understand where major sources of pollution, hazard waste are located within our communities. And it's only by understanding the intersection between those two sources of vulnerability that we can identify areas of environmental justice concern. The third layer is actually health data regarding adverse outcomes such as higher cancer rates, higher risk of asthma. Because the main assumption of environmental justice is because we have an unequal distribution of environmental pollution, certain populations are more likely to have those adverse health outcomes. I'm going to talk a little bit less about health outcome for full disclosure here, just because environmental agencies are less likely to have health outcome data because of privacy concerns. We can talk more about this maybe at the end of the talk, but generally speaking, these are the three big groups of data that are needed to design environmental justice policies and to participate in environmental justice policy making. Now, government agencies are providing this data more and more online on their website. These are the results of our initial project that looked at open government data website across all 50 US states. The states that are here highlighted in dark blue are the ones that provide a good level of open government data. The ones that are in dark blue provide some data on environmental justice. Gray states generally provide only environmental information, but not information on social vulnerability. And white states provide no data whatsoever. And just to give you a little bit more concrete example, when these data are provided, they look something like these. They're generally displayed on data dashboard where the states made effort to try to identify which area have some level of environmental justice concern. The ones here, for instance, in red or orange, and which area are less of a priority for environmental justice, the one, for instance, in green. But the more we look into these issues, right, there are still a lot of gaps when we think about the implementation of this idea of open government data. As the map showed, the implementation is still somewhat limited across states. Generally speaking, only 1 out of 5 states provide a level of data that are complete, usable, and accessible enough for someone to be able to say, my community has environmental justice concern, or my community doesn't have environmental justice concern. There is also some issues of state governments generally reporting low engagement with local communities. While those data are provided, it doesn't necessarily mean that the governments are actively collaborating with the public to make sense of this data and to analyze this data, which also lead to underlying issues of trust between the government and the communities. Part of these issues stem from data themselves, which are generally self-disclosed information from private companies and businesses, and so the community does not trust them. Some of these data are also not granular, or they're not up-to-date enough for the communities to actually be able to participate into the policy making. And more broadly speaking, there are historical issues of disenfranchisement between those local communities, particularly vulnerable groups, and the state governments. So this is like somewhat the landscape where we started our project, understanding that the states are doing something, that something is not enough, and that there are big issues of low engagement and lower trust with the communities. And part of our reflection moved on to this idea that maybe an explanation for these challenges that public administration and communities are facing lies in the values that public organizations are enacting and putting into practice in the way that they manage their data. As some of you might know, public organizations are generally considered to be bureaucratic organizations where laws and rules are central to their functioning. And in this context, data are kind of perceived as an asset that public organizations should protect and not release to the public. Things have changed a little bit over time with the introduction of a more managerial approach to public organization. that has been actually used more and more to measure the performance of organizations. And more recently, with this idea of open government, right, public organizations have moved more towards values such as transparency and participation, and data is now perceived as public good that should be released to the public. But if you want to push this idea a little bit forward, we argue that what we need to look is also at equity values. Equity values are more about justice and fairness in a way to, justice and fairness to try to redistribute some of the power and resources that are being unequally distributed so far. And this is at the core of the idea of environmental justice. And in this context, right, if we think about data, we argue that data should become not necessarily just a public good, but an active responsibility of government. And we use this term of inclusive open government data and data practice to refer to this idea that if we think about equity values, then we should emphasize more and more the rights of communities to participate into the governance of environmental justice data. And it should be government responsibility to involve environmental justice communities in the design and implementation of open government data, which translate in things like designing rules for access data and collecting them with local community, integrating data that are collected by government and businesses with data that are collected by the communities, using more tools that are citizens-led, like community mapping, to actually understand local needs. And with this project, what we wanted to understand is to what extent these practices are actually put into place by environmental agencies across the states. So we went on and we collected some data by conducting a national surveys of individuals that occupy top managerial position in state environmental agencies. We focus on the agency leadership, individuals that are specifically in charge of environmental justice policies, individuals that work in the enforcement of environmental regulations, and then individuals in charge of IT management or GIS and open data for environmental agencies specifically. We collected their contact information in the full semester of 2021. We conducted a few preliminary interviews to kind of pre-test some of our questions and get a little bit more insights. We got students to test our questions for clarity. And then we opened up the survey in summer of 2022 and closed them early in September of the past full semester. We got a response rate of 16%, which is a pretty good response rate given the type of sample frame, and translate in around 50 respondents, which is not a large number, but it gives us at least a little bit of an understanding of what state environmental agencies are doing. And as I'm going to show you in a moment, the sample we collected is quite interesting, even in the composition of the different managers. So we got responses from 37 states, at least one response from 37 states, 18 of which were Democratic and 17 of them were Republican. So we got a pretty good spread in terms of political representations. This graph shows you the positions that our respondents occupy. As you can see, we got a lot of responses from compliance and enforcement managers, so individuals that are in charge of enforcing environmental regulations. And we got 15 responses from environmental justice coordinators. This is a particularly high number considering that there are only 20 environmental justice coordinators across all the 50 states, because it's a position that is pretty new. What's interesting to see here is that when we look at the percentage of non-white and female respondent, community engagement and environmental justice coordinators are the most diverse position. These are the only places where female represent more than half of our respondents, and non-white respondents represent approximately half of the responses we received. Leadership position, compliance and enforcement, and IT positions tends to be much more predominantly white and male respondent. When asked whether or not they are in charge or participate in any activities pertaining to environmental justice, the vast majority of respondents, basically everyone apart one person, replied that they are to a great extent or somewhat involved in environmental justice, really showcasing how important this topic has become for environmental agencies across all agencies' positions. We then asked them a bunch of questions that were related to either their work group activities and practices, meaning by work group we refer to themselves, but also middle managers and frontline employees with which they work closely, and some questions about their individual perception and attitudes around three main topics: engagement with stakeholders, data practices, and values. So with regard to engagement, what we found is that most of our respondents engage pretty often with all these different group of stakeholders. The scale goes from never to weekly, with some groups like citizens, business, or local governments that interact with those respondents on an almost weekly basis. But there is a huge gap once we measure the influence that these actors have on policy making. So while interaction is pretty high up, most of these actors do not have as much influence. The gap is particularly significant for citizens that have high interaction and only moderate influence, businesses, but also environmental justice community. And by environmental justice community, we specifically refer with local, low income and minority community members. This idea that there is a lot of interaction but low influence, it's kind of reflected also in the way that governments decide to interact with its citizens. As you can see from this graph, the most common activities is to interact with citizens to explain government decisions. More active interaction, like developing strategies, identifying goal objectives, or evaluating achievement and performance, have a much lower likelihood of happening, with most of the respondents saying that they very little engage in any of these activities. Similar, when we look at the type of tools that are implemented to engage stakeholders around open government data, the good news is that a lot of these agencies report using tools like interactive digital maps. It's almost 90% of our respondents, online citizens reporting apps, or open government data portals. But as you might notice, the highest frequency tools are generally what we consider to be government-led tools. Is the government providing data to the citizens? Is the government designing those digital maps? The more we move down into this graph, the more we have citizens-led tools like citizens advisory boards or citizen science program. These are much less likely to be adopted by environmental agencies. So again, there is this idea that there is a lot of interaction with the government, but most of this interaction is somewhat passive and top-down, with the exception of online citizens reporting apps, which are quite widespread and are at least a starting point of interaction between citizens and government. If we look in a little bit more details about the use of open government data for environmental justice specifically, the good news is that most of the agency regularly, or at least regularly, utilize and publish data on open government data portals. There is also great commitment towards making data more accessible to others, designing rules and procedures, engaging stakeholders, and more broadly, creating, developing, or maintaining environmental justice tools. All of these elements receive a response rate of over 50%, considering very large or a moderate extent of commitment. However, when we ask specifically about inclusive data practice, which means to involve minority and low-income communities specifically in data governance within environmental agencies, those percentages drop significantly. While most environmental agencies utilize and collect data on environmental justice communities to evaluate the policy impact, very small percentage of them engage those communities in building capacity to utilize the data, to integrate community knowledge into policymaking, to collect community level data, or even to identify data needs and gaps at the local level. So while openness seems to be quite, openness practices seems to be quite integrated into environmental agencies, inclusive data practices are less frequently enacted. To look for an explanation of those results, we start asking managers regarding values that are promoted within those organizations. In particular, we ask them to what extent equity values are at stake with the overall policy goals of their organizations, efficiency, and rule and procedures. And what it's interesting that emerged, an interesting finding that emerged from this question is that generally speaking, managers do not think that equity is at stake with policy goals or with efficiency. You can see that a vast majority of managers disagree or strongly disagree with the statement, but managers seems to identify this idea of equity with rule and procedures. We saw that from our preliminary interviews. The perspective of manager is oftentimes that rules and procedures are already designed to protect everyone, and therefore there is no need to give particular consideration to certain groups of the population. So in that regard, equity values are achieved through following rules and procedures within the organization. Interesting enough, some of these questions, the overall score for these questions vary when we split the sample and analyze responses for white and not white respondent. Generally speaking, white respondents are more likely to see equity being at stake with efficiency and challenging policy goal achievements, whereas non-white respondents are less likely to perceive equity as something that is at stake with other values. We also ask managers whether it's their role to advocate for more equitable distribution of services to minority residents, whether it's their role to put more effort into providing information to elected officials regarding minority residents, and whether they should advocate for policies that address needs of minority residents. As you can see here, the vast majority of respondents do believe that these are roles of public administrators. But then again, so once we split the sample between white and not white, we find some small but significant difference, whereas non-white administrators are more likely to report that public administrators should put extra effort into promoting the needs of minority groups. So what does those results means when we think about the broader picture of open government data and environmental justice? Well, some of our preliminary findings that we've discussed, and I'm looking forward to hear other inputs. Well, first of all, we are seeing more and more that openness values are integrating into environmental agencies practice. And this is good news because governments aren't putting more effort into providing information, especially in the past couple of years. There are more and more open government data websites that have been created. We also see that there are various tools that are used to provide data. In other words, it's not only an open government data where everything is done, but there is more effort to create, for instance, data visualization dashboard. However, when we think about open government data, there is still a significant gap in engagement. A lot of these tools are generally government-led instead of being citizens-led. And also the engagement activities that are put into place by government are generally to explain to citizens rather than to engage them in designing goals and strategies. Part of these answers, it's probably because a lot of equity values are still only marginally integrated into the activities of public organization, and in particular in the way that data are conceptualized. This is clear from the low influence that civil society stakeholders has within environmental agencies, but also in this idea that rules and procedures are already a good enough guarantee of equitable redistribution of resources and equal engagement of different communities. Furthermore, we found some race differences in values and perception of the administrator role and in the values that are implemented in public organization, which is partially problematic because, at least in our sample, non-white respondents are more likely to work in narrowly defined areas, such as environmental justice coordinators or community engagement. And so they have somewhat a more limited ability to affect the organization as a whole because they work only in certain selected areas. So what we'd like to do next, and what we think is a really important information, is how can public organization lead the cultural change by integrating more equity value within openness and data practice. Some hypotheses stemming from our preliminary findings suggest that maybe something to look at is to reinforce internal communication, to facilitate communication exchange of information, but also to facilitate diffusion of different perspectives around organizational and data practice. If we think that minority public managers that belong to minority groups tend to be concentrated in certain work position, right? Better internal communication might help a better diffusion of those different values and perspectives. The second one is to maybe change the focus on data as the ending point. A lot of open government data practices are all about releasing those data, and that's it, right? But maybe releasing the data should only be the starting point, and we should start reframing our perception around data as a neutral object, but rather and conceptualize that as more of a way to start an interaction and a dialogue with local communities around what should we collect, how we should collect, and how we should visualize the data. And we plan to further analyze this data to get to some of those questions, but also probably to conduct some interviews and case studies. But I'm kind of looking forward also to get some inputs on what could be important to understand next. And with that, I kind of thank you all for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions.